Welcome back. So we just kind of introduced what island biogeography is and what the theory is. So let's take a little more look at, what the evidence shows. There's obviously evidence that supported the creation of the theory, but since then there's been a lot of evidence, and let's take a look at how some ways that some of those ideas have been refined a little bit, and how some of the evidence the data actually fits those models. So here, and I apologize, there's kind of a lot of figures here that we're just going to sort of buzz through. And I'm obviously not expecting you to memorize any specific trend that I'm talking about here. We're just looking at how the overall patterns fit to the theory of island biogeography. So here we're looking at the turnover rates of birds on islands in Gatun Lake in Panama. And we see that it tends to decrease with increasing island area and increasing isolation. So remember, the turnover rate is basically new species showing up to replace species going extinct. We see the turnover rate decreases with increasing area, and a similar sort of thing going on with isolation here. We have what's called this rescue effect, and I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, as the distance from the mainland or to the mainland increases, you get this decrease in the turnover rate. And basically, what you're seeing here is that the rescue effect is basically if you're an island that's close, then species that are on the brink of going extinct tend to get rescued in effect from new species showing up. There's also something called the target effect, which is basically that larger islands tend to attract more immigrants because they're larger, and so more immigration occurs, and that's sort of the difference between the target effect and the rescue effect. Not necessarily something you need to have memorized there, but just something to be aware of. Here we're looking at recolonization by terrestrial arthropods of 4 small mangrove islands as a function of time since they were removed. So this is an experiment. They removed these 4 species of arthropods. I don't remember specifically what species they were, but they removed them. And then so the days after defaunation just means the removal of those species, days after the removal, and you can sort of see the number of species present, sort of showing you the diversity, and these numbers sort of indicate the pre-removal. So they removed not just species but groups of species, and so these indicate the pre-removal levels, like where were they before, like how abundant were they before they removed them. And then the lines here show the actual data. And what you can see, and maybe you can't, but I'll explain it here, is that after maybe about 80 days, they're pretty much sorted to their original abundances, where this one was the highest in purple. You can see it's highest here, and then yellow takes a little bit, but yellow becomes highest, and then the blue, yellow and blue are pretty close, and then red is much less abundant. Doesn't take very long for them to sort into their pre-removal abundance levels. Something interesting is that we're talking about islands here, but this phenomenon of isolation and area doesn't necessarily have to mean a literal island in the ocean. You could have some other areas that are isolated from other areas, and you get an effective island. So here we're looking at isolated mountain ranges in the Great Basin of the Western North America. And these are islands that are cool, they're music, and they're forest habitats, and they're isolated by a sea of basically a desert. And so we're looking at this area here, isolated by desert and sort of surrounded by mountains on either side here. And we see some interesting trends here. So species area relationships for the boreal residents, as far as birds and terrestrial mammals, exhibit very similar trends of what we'd expect for island biogeography. So as the area, here it's being categorized as the area above a certain elevation. As that area increases, we get an increase in the number of birds and an increase in the number of small mammals. Both of those increase as we would expect through the theory of island biogeography. So let's continue on here. Here we're seeing species isolation and species area relationships for non-volant, which means the forest mammals that cannot fly. That's what non-volant means. For 27 montane or mountain islands in the American Southwest. So same area here, and we're again seeing this relationship where as area increases, species richness increases. As isolation increases, species richness decreases. So fitting very well within the model of island biogeography. Here we're seeing species area relationships for fish inhabiting the lakes of northern North America. Again, very similar. If you can look at the area of the lake and see that the number of species increases as the area of the lake increases for fish species. Here we're seeing the species area relationships for fish inhabiting the much older lakes of Central and Eastern Africa, so the cichlids. And again, you're seeing they're differentiating here. I'll come back to that, but you get this increase, the area as the area of the lake increases, so does the number of species. But you have different relationships, whether you're a lake that has where speciation has occurred or a lake where speciation has not occurred. There's different relationships there. Similar sort of thing going on here, where you have fish species richness in rivers as a function. So this is for rivers, not in lakes. But again, as the drainage area increases, you get an increase in the species richness, and that's different rates for North America and Western Europe, but overall same trend is that as that area increases, so too does the number of species. So what you can take away from this is that no matter what species, type of organism you're looking at, or the environment, these things tend to hold up, whereas the area increases, so too does the number of species. Waterfowl here, and I think this is also in, let's see, it says area of lakes or catchment basins. I think this is also in North America. As the area of the lake increases, so does the number of species of waterfowl. So something that's sort of going on here, and it isn't necessarily apparent if you're looking at just figures of population number or species numbers, is sort of the different interactions and what's going on a temporal scale. And so if you have some defaunation event, and again, that just means the removal of all the species. A good example of that was like the volcano in Krakatoa that we talked about in the first video, wipes out pretty much all the life. So as species show up, there's not very many species present. And so they're not really interacting with one another. They're just sort of showing up and getting established. And so the number of species tends to increase. When you get to a certain level, the density gets high enough that organisms are now interacting with one another. They might be competing with one another. They might be predator-prey relationships, whatever it could be going on, that usually tends to sort of plateau the number of species. So it's increasing and then it sort of plateaus and decreases a little bit. And over time, you get some basically sorting where species fall into their respective niche space. And theoretically, they're well adapted to that niche space, and so they thrive a little bit more. And then you can get, as a result, another increase in the number of species as this process takes place, and then new species are probably still showing up. So you get an increase, and then over time, maybe new species are showing up, other species are going extinct, and what you end up having is over long enough time, new species are actually evolving. And so that's going to increase the total number of species as you get sort of a equilibrium between species showing up and species going extinct, and then you have new species evolving on the island. So yeah, just a few more things of evidence here is that immigration rates across ice-covered St. Lawrence River here, again, immigration rates increasing with island area. So as that river, the St. Lawrence River, freezes over, there's some islands there that can be reached by organisms that wouldn't normally be able to reach it because they cannot fly and maybe are not going to swim there. but as they're able to disperse over the ice, you can see that the immigration rates increase with. There's not a line here, but you can kind of see it with island area. The diversity of seaborne plant propagules. Propagules are just like new organisms showing up along the beaches of islands in Australia increases with the length of the beachfront. So this is a sort of a different way of looking at it, but a similar sort of thing where as the length of the beach increases, the number of species, plant species showing up tends to increase in a very linear sort of fashion here. So that's another, just it's basically getting at the same thing, but just sort of a different way of looking at it. So what's all going on here? I want to sort of take a pause, and there's lots of data, different experiments and studies that we can look that all support to varying degrees the theory of island biogeography. But there's a few different things going on here. So we have the traditional MacArthur Wilson model published here on these two. These are both the same here. Basically showing that, as a function of immigration and extinction, um, you, you reach an equilibrium of the number of species dependent on those two things when immigration um, basically when these two lines cross, when immigration decreases to a point and extinction increases to a point, you get equilibrium depending on whether it's a large or small island or a near or far island. And you have these varying effects called the target effect, which is really affecting the immigration rates. So you have a larger island, you're going to have higher immigration rates. And the rescue effect, which is about the isolation. So if you have a far away island, you're not going to get rescued as much if you're a species that's going extinct. And if you're closer, then you're more likely to get rescued. That's really the modification that's going on here. So it's just kind of shifting these equilibrium points based off of different immigration rates or different extinction rates. But really the crux is that, if you're the island, if you're a large island, you're going to have more species than a small island. If you're a faraway island, you're going to have less species than a close island, is the takeaway there. And so if we wanted to sort of come back to this general model idea and sort of fit some more specific things to it, we have our species richness here on the y-axis, and we have our island area, and we know that as island area increases, so too does our species richness. But there are different, it is not linear. So it's a non-linear relationship, which means that there's these small island effects. If you're really, really small, it doesn't really matter up until a certain point, and then it starts mattering. And then if you get really large, if you're a large island, it doesn't really matter for a while. Where it starts to matter, and this is going to be new information, where it starts to matter is that if you're large enough, you're going to have higher rates of what's called in situ speciation. Basically, that means speciation that's happening within the island. So you're going to have new species showing up, you're going to have species going extinct, but then you're also going to have new species evolving right there on the island from the species that are there over enough time. So that can influence that as well. Similarly, if we're looking at, so this, oh yeah, I forgot, I should mention, there's a typo on this figure from the textbook. This should say isolation here, so a general model for isolation. As isolation increases, you get a decrease in species richness. However, if you get to a certain point, then you start to see an increase in species richness if you have enough isolation. And you might think originally, or you might wonder, why would isolation necessarily play a role in speciation? And this goes back to something that we've talked about before. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to that. I had these. Sorry, I thought these slides were in a different order here. I'll come back to why that is. But here we're seeing, again, that small island effect, which refers to the tendency of species richness of some island, insular faunas, island organisms to remain relatively low, independent of area for the smallest islands. So basically, the number of species isn't really changing much, and this is just going over this again, but it doesn't really change much until you get to a certain point. Then it's going to start increasing. So not much difference in species richness if you're small between these smaller islands. Okay, so I want to come back to this idea of phylogenesis and speciation happening on the island and what exactly is going on. So this is sort of a different way of looking at this. Here we're looking at the colonization rate. So that just means the rate at which new organisms or new species are showing up to the island. And this is, basically immigration, and it's functioning the same way. As you increase in isolation, the colonization or immigration rate is going to decrease. We've already looked at that pretty much. The difference here is you have these other two lines is that they represent phylogenesis. And basically you can think of that as speciation. So evolution of new species is going to occur. And so it's a different sort of relationship. So as isolation increases, you get an increase in phylogenesis. The increase is larger for large islands than it is on small islands. But again, this doesn't really explain why this would be the case. If you want to, you can pause the video and think about why might isolation contribute to more phylogenesis, or in other words, more species evolving, and new species evolving. Why would isolation play a role in that? So if you want to, go ahead and pause it, and then I'll give you a second, and then we can talk about why that is. So you may have remembered, if you took a minute to think about that, you may have remembered back weeks ago that we talked about this thing called gene flow when we were talking about evolution. And gene flow increases the genetic similarity between populations. So if you remember that when we talked about this, basically if you have these two populations, the more gene flow you have between them, the more similar these two populations will get. So basically, you're decreasing the genetic diversification between them. So if you were to cut off the gene flow, you would get a diversification between these two because they're not sharing genes anymore. And so this population would diversify from this one, and they would split off, and maybe over enough time would actually become different species. So if we consider, or if we, think about a scenario where this is a mainland and this is an island, basically the same thing. The less gene flow you have, the more different these are going to get. And so if it's more and more isolated, you're going to get more speciation because there's less gene flow, and less similarities between the two. So that's basically what's going on there. And if we wanted to look at this basically in the same way here, but it's just a little more detailed, we can say, as the rate of gene flow declines with increasing isolation, phylogenesis becomes increasingly important to the number of species, and the relative number of endemic species increases. So this goes back to this idea of being endemic. You're only found in one location. And here we're talking about island endemics. And so the islands have more endemic species on them because of this isolation. Over time, phylogenesis will produce endemic clades, so entire groups of endemic organisms, in this figure represented by the branching symbols in these shaded areas. And so that becomes progressively richer in species, especially on larger islands. So basically what this figure is saying is that the proportion of species that are endemic tends to increase as you increase in isolation. So basically the non-endemic species decreases, and as over time you get a greater proportion of endemic species as the total number of species decreases. And so that's basically what's going on there. As isolation increases, you're getting more isolation genetically, and so you end up with more unique and distinct evolutionary lineages on islands. So it's really sort of combining all of these things that we've been talking about and putting them into one overarching theory of island biogeography. And if we were to put these on sort of a spatial and temporal extent here, I'll wrap this video up here in a second. The scheme of the scale dependence, basically what we're seeing here is a scale dependence of these things. So at low spatial extents and low temporal extents, basically small areas in short periods of time, then individuals and the behavior and physiological dynamics of individual organisms is what's shaping most of those patterns. At intermediate levels of area and time, it's sort of the population and community dynamics, the demographics of how populations are growing and shrinking, and the communities of how those different organisms interact with one another. At large scale spatial extents and large amounts of time, then you're getting into the evolutionary and geologic dynamics where we're talking about, how are whole taxonomic groups of organisms evolving and what's their evolutionary lineages and those sorts of characteristics. So sort of putting all of these things on a temporal and spatial scale so you can sort of visualize when and where different interactions and forces become important. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up this video. Been going on for a little bit. There's an interesting sort of news article, sort of like it's an interesting article I wanted to include here about bird watching, and so have a read through that, and I'll see you in the next video.